move on to the next presenter, Mr. Ian Pratt, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Bahamas Power and Light, one of our most favorite people here in Abaco. Speaking personally, I went without power for 9 months, and the first days having power back was incredible. It's amazing what it's like to live in the 21st century. So thank you for everything you and your crews have done, and I'll leave it up to you to give an update. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Hutton. I believe we were spoken before. It's nice to see you in person.
Good to see you, Tony. Yeah.
Good day to you, and good day to the other panelists as well. It's a pleasure to be on the call this morning, and I want to congratulate the team there for, as you mentioned, putting on this first ever virtual Abaco Business Outlook online. As you know, that I'm going to give a presentation this morning on where we are in Abaco, but I also want to speak to infrastructural development from a utility standpoint in general. And so if I can, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we've got it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So very quickly, I just want to give a short timeline on BPL itself. And so electricity has been around in the Bahamas for a very long time. We started out in 1907 under the Electric Light Act and the Electricity Department of the Ministry of Works, with BEC being formally established in 1956 at the passage of the first Electricity Act. In the 80s, actually in 1974, we moved into Abaco for the first time. Throughout the remaining 70s, 80s, 90s, we would have taken over a number of franchise providers within the Abaco territory, including Green Turtle Key, Marsh Harbor Power and Light, and Treasure Key was the latest one in 2008. Subsequent to that, we built the largest power station in the Family Islands at Wilson City in 2010. In 2013, the government started the energy sector reform process, which culminated in the passage of the new Electricity Act in 2015, which established BPL. Since that time, we've been going through quite a bit. And in 2018, we signed an MOU with Shell North America for an LNG to power plant here in New Providence. At the same time, we released RFPs in 2019 for Family Island renewables. We started the Ragged Island Solar Project. We went ahead with Station A at Clifton Pier. And of course, the infamous Dorian would have affected our systems in the Abaco territory. So this is an eye test chart for you, but this just speaks to the scope and scale of the operations of BPL. Throughout the country, we have power stations that range in size from 0.2 megawatts to 200 megawatts across our service territory of 17 islands, about 110,000 customers. The Abaco operation itself represents our second largest service territory. It's our largest territory outside of New Providence. Prior to Hurricane Dorian, we had about 9,100 customers in Abaco. We're going to talk a little bit more about where we are, but at present, at the September 30th billing, because, you know, as part of that 21st century, Mr. Hutton, billing is included inside there. We had 4,600 customers back to the grid at that point. The peak load in Abaco had risen in early 2019 to about 26 megawatts, and that was following a period of steady growth on the island. To meet that demand, we have 3 power stations, our main power plant at Wilson City, where we have 4 12-megawatt engines, Marsh Harbor, our peaking plant, where we have 2 engines, and then a smaller facility in Morris Island, which supplies that island separately. Abaco was seen before the storm as a fantastic opportunity for sustained profitability in the Family Island, which is always of key concern to us here at BPL. And as such, we would have committed to having a director level and executive was placed in charge of Abaco with a view to helping to develop the staff and helping to develop the network such that we would make Abaco a model for the Family Islands. And so our system in Abaco, this is just a quick picture that shows that we extend from Crown Haven all the way to Sandy Point with our transmission network in Abaco. And we also service a large number of keys, some with less than 10 customers and some of the major keys as well. So this is a simplified version of that. The two yellow circles show where our power stations are located, and it shows the line that goes all the way north to Crown Haven, and the line going all the way south to Sandy Point, and the interconnectivity between the two power stations at Marsh Harbor and Wilson City. So in general, when we talk about infrastructural improvement and development, there's a few things that we consider. First is we want to make sure whatever we do is fit for the intended purpose. We want to make sure we have sufficient capacity on the ground. We want to make sure we have reliability and redundancy. And we want to have ongoing reinforcement in anticipation of growth in these areas. So we have to anticipate what the load growth is going to be, where the development is taking place, and we partner with a number of entities in doing so. But we seek to ensure we stay ahead of growth and development in all of our service territories. All of our work is under strategic planning or policy or some regulation. And I mentioned the Electricity Act of 2015 before. That set out the government's national energy policy under which we function. It established ERCA as our sector regulator. And more recently, the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection is now overseeing all works to ensure that there's environmental stewardship considered. Of course, cost is always a big factor, and the availability of capital to execute these infrastructural improvements is always of key concern. We're always fighting between generation and transmission, or depending on what project we want to push forward to go. And we always consider the environmental impact of our work, as well as whatever land that's available to do what it is we would like to have done. So in Abaco, I mentioned the peak demand was 26 megawatts. And in Abaco, we had installed in that Wilson City Power Station 48 megawatts, giving us a total of 56 megawatts of generation capacity on the island. So there was certainly much more capacity than needed in Abaco. We went with such a large power station all the way back in 2010 because at the time there was envisioned significant load growth from a few projects on the island, and we wanted to make sure we were ready. Some of those projects have not manifested, but at present, we have more than sufficient generation in order to meet the present demand. And those are broken up in smaller machines. So what we try to do is make sure if you lose the largest two machines for any reason, you're still able to supply all of the customers. And that is why the station was developed the way it was. On the transmission side, Abaco was similar to many of the family islands where, as I showed in that graphic, we have a single line starting at the power station, going all the way to the north, going all the way to the south. The line itself is capable of supplying all the demand that we have. The only challenge with having single lines is if you lose that line, then that's an opportunity for customers to be without supply. And so we talked about the national energy policy, and that's only a section of this slide I will cover. That sought to improve the security of energy supply through the diversification of fuels. It was seeking to modernize the country's energy infrastructure, wanting to develop renewable energy sources, and the government was to be one of those leading adopters there. And it was sought to have improvements in energy conservation and efficiency. The backdrop of the financial losses that BPL has suffered over the years, and given the difficulty sometimes in developing a business case for some of these developments in the family island territories where the customer base is smaller, the availability of capital is always of concern. But given the fact that the cost of production is typically higher in the family islands, it lends itself to opportunities like renewable adoption, et cetera, for us to go with. Of course, we're still competing with all the other territories for whatever funding we have available, and unforeseen events tend to affect what it is that we can do. Then there's always consideration and prioritization of the things that we're trying to accomplish, whether we work on generation or transmission, whether we do certain things to harden the network, which costs more and take longer in terms of installation process and periods, whether we go overhead, underground. All of these are things that we consistently discuss here when we're talking about developing infrastructure in our various service territories. So in Abaco, make it a little bit more germane to the topic today, I mentioned that we have two power stations on the mainland, Marsh Harbor and Wilson City. The first issue, of course, is we do have sufficient generation, as I mentioned, but given the damage sustained in Dorian, we now faced with the need to rehabilitate both of those stations. The Marsh Harbor plant itself suffered significant damage to the building, the roofing, the siding, the tank farm, the substations, everything. And so that's going to take significant effort to either rebuild or replace. The Wilson City plant, while it suffered less damage, still had roof damage and some other issues that introduced water into the plant. And everybody knows water and electricity do not mix. And so that presented several challenges as well, but we are well on the way with that plant, and 2 of those machines are actually online at present on test. One of the other opportunities post-Dorian restoration offered was the ability to standardize. And when I say that, I mentioned we took over franchises from Green Turtle Key, Treasure Key, and several others, and everybody was doing something slightly differently. And so on the island, we have all of these different voltages that people had used prior to us taking them over and that we continue to use. But now we're going to whittle those down to 2 voltages in order to standardize to make things a little bit easier from a management perspective. What we're also doing in the north of Abaco is reinforcing the system in the north, whereas there was only 1 transmission line heading north that, if impacted, would have resulted in an outage to customers in the north. We will be putting in 2, such that we will have some level of redundancy there. We'll be adding in substations as well that we can remotely monitor from the Wilson City Power Station and commit operations and put people's supply back on if it goes off, sitting from the comfort of the power station rather than having to drive all the way from Marsh Harbor to the north to do various works. We are redesigning some of the system within Marsh Harbor as well, putting in some new substations there also for remote monitoring and control, putting in some underground cabling as well. A lot of this is going to be on the back end of the restoration of the customers, which we wanted to prioritize rather than developing the system immediately. We're adding some redundancy in our keys loop. We have what we call the keys loop that runs through several of the keys now, and that gives us some redundancy to backfeed in the event of a failure. But we're going to strengthen that loop as well within this restoration process. And so this is the existing layout, just as an example of the reinforcement work that I referred to, where we have the 2 power stations once again in yellow and the single line going all the way north. And this is what we're going to be looking at the end, where we're putting in 2 lines going north all the way to Cooperstown. And we'd be able to monitor these 3 blue dots, the 3 substations back from the office and determine if there's a problem, take some steps to correct and move on. System hardening is also something that we're doing. That those same 2 lines going to the north in Abaco will be built for the first time in the Bahamas on ductile iron poles. That's going to allow them to be able to withstand Category 5 events, the poles themselves anyway. And so that's one of the projects we'll be starting shortly. The Marsh Harbor transmission lines going from Marsh Harbor out towards the Green Turtle Key ferry dock has been built on stronger pole classes that can take much more storm impact than the previous lines could have. We'll be putting in some underground cables, as I mentioned before, to the critical infrastructure, the hospital in particular. And we'll be installing solar microgrids at the critical sites. And so that's going to include the Cooperstown Clinic, the Sandy Point Clinic Airport, the Marsh Harbor Hospital, the government offices, the airport, and the main water and sewage site near to the airport there. What those solar microgrids will do is that they will feed into the grid normally, but if there is an outage or a problem, they will be able to disconnect from the grid and continue supplying energy to those critical sites until the grid is reconnected again. Company-wide, we have a few projects that are ongoing that will also impact Abaco. The Advanced Metering Infrastructure Project, which will require the change out of all of our meters to give us the ability to see them from the office as well. It will allow us to immediately tell if you're having a problem in your house, if you're having an outage or whatever, and we'll be able to dispatch without having to wait for customers to call in. It will allow us to put in prepaid metering as well for those customers that desire it. And it will allow us to remotely disconnect, reconnect. Right now, customers who want to move or change their bills have to come in, close the account, wait for reimbursement, et cetera. but this system will allow us to do that all in one shot. The LNG conversion part of the Family Island Fuel Diversification Project, the Wilson City plant, we had identified the Wilson City plant for converting those machines to be able to run gas and liquid. Obviously, that has been delayed by the storm, the impact of the storm itself. And then we have a number of Family Island solar projects throughout the country. So with all of that, I want to just give a really brief update on where we are with Dorian. First, with the challenges, the first was just the level of damage that we saw in Dorian, which was, it cannot under-describe, if I could use that word, the level of damage that we saw, particularly in the Marsh Harbor and Treasure Key, Central Abaco area. Most of that network from Marsh Harbor to Treasure Key was totally destroyed, and we had to rebuild that network, something that took decades to develop. But people expect overhead infrastructural damage during a hurricane. But in this particular case, because of the intensity of the storm, we had damage to the power stations, to the underground cabling, to ground-mounted equipment, and to the subsea cabling, all of which we now have to build back or repair. And once again, the available capital to do that is something that we're working with the government, and they've been supporting us in that regard. Because transmission and distribution infrastructure in the region of the Caribbean is not covered under typical insurance, because they've noticed that there are hurricanes in this particular region. And so we now have to put back much of that infrastructure on our own. Really quickly, this is a chart developed in the States, and it's echoed by the National Weather Service and some other people, which speaks, and I cut just a portion of the chart that spoke to what you can expect in typical hurricanes. And you notice they stopped at category 4, saying that power outages could last weeks to months. They did not include category 5 because what they said is that in category 5 events, it really depends on the actual intensity, the duration of the storm, all of these things that Dorian brought to bear on Abaco. So the damages to the system in Abaco are depicted by this graphic. This entire section between Marsh Harbor and Blackwood was destroyed. The line was totally flattened, connecting the north of Abaco to central and south. And all of the communities connected to that central area, Leisurely, Turtle Rocks, Bahama Coral Island, Marsh Harbor, Treasure Key, Green Turtle, all of those suffered extensive damage. In addition, one of the 2 transmission lines between Wilson City and Marsh Harbor were also significantly damaged, but the second line, which was built at a higher storm rating, was able to handle most of the storm impact. We just had to replace about 30 or so poles on that particular line. Additional challenges, we had staffing issues, manpower. Our local staff, as the video that Mr. Cargill showed, they were significantly impacted by the event themselves. So we had to evacuate them from the island initially. But we sent in staffing out of Long Island, Eleuthera, Nassau, as well as rehired former staff members, hired contractors. We received assistance from the Caribbean Association of Electric Companies, CARELEC. We got assistance from 6 different countries to come and assist us with rebuilding the network as well. Housing was a major challenge. Our local staff, their homes were destroyed as well. Hotels, guest houses, apartments were unavailable. So we had to house staff at the power station, which of course is not ideal. There was some availability in North and South Abaco that we were able to take on. And then we had a man camp style arrangement within Marsh Harbor to house the CARELEC teams as they came in. Materials, equipment, and logistics, of course, for a restoration this size, the effort is gargantuan in terms of being able to just supply all of the equipment and material that is needed to sustain the teams as they continue to work. So on the strategy side, the first thing is we look at access to the areas, health and safety concerns, the condition of our plants, the overall design of the network, the level of the damage to the system again, and that dictates how we proceed with our restoration strategy. So just a couple of quick pictures. If you look at the upper left, that is part of Marsh Harbor, what was left of it after the event, and some other pictures around the island of the teams as they were working. So in the restoration process right now, the first area to come back was Morris Island. They had limited damage there. Their power station had limited damage as well. They came on September the 8th following the passage of the storm. We then moved into South Abaco, repaired those lines. We had a number of poles to replace there. We put in some temporary generation at Wilson City and brought on the South on October the 1st. The North followed on the 3rd of November, all the way from Cooperstown up to Little Abaco in Crown Haven. We then came south of there to pick up the Blackwood Fire Road community as well. As I mentioned before, Central Abaco was devastated. We began work there restoring supply to the hospital, airport, water and sewage facilities, et cetera. That was done by December the 4th. And then we continued work within the Treasure Key, Green Turtle Key, Marsh Harbor communities, just building the lines back. Most of Marsh Harbor has been restored at present. We are still working in Dundas Town. Although the high voltage network has been restored, we have some low voltage work to do. And we are working, we'll be starting work actually in the Eastern Shores community next week. Bahama Coral Island was the last community that just came on the weekend. So they are enjoying, Mr. Hutton, the same time that you would have had when you got your supply. And we should be energizing leisurely tomorrow. On the keys, Abaco has a large number of keys. And I mentioned they range in size from hundreds of customers to less than 10. We had a number of subsea cable damages affecting the keys, and we're working with the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection now to have those cables replaced. But we do have restoration on Little Grand Key, Green Turtle Key, Elbow Key, Manawa Key, Great Guana Key, and Scotland Key is in progress. In all of these, on most of them, we brought out generation to bypass the cable, such that we can get supply back on to the customers. But we are working on cables right now for Lubbers Key and Matlows Key. Customer reconnections are ongoing. We're receiving about 75 applications per week. As it relates to that, we have a dedicated team that's accepting those applications and connecting those customers. So with that, I would just wish to say thank you again to the panel. I know I ran a little long, but thank you to the panel and to the organizers for having me. And I want to say thank you certainly to the team on the ground that's been working tremendously hard throughout the time. I want to say thank you to the team here that supported them as well. And to assure the people from Abaco that we will be there until every last customer is back on supply. Thank you very much.